Hey guys, we have a brand new book out by Back to Jerusalem. I actually did this book together with Bethany. I think I started this book several years ago. It's been probably one of the most important projects that I've ever kind of journeyed on.
No, you started it several years ago. Just now finding this out for the first time.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you remember or not, but I gave you a phone call specifically. I was doing research for Robert Morrison. And when I was doing research for him, I came across this name, Karl Gutzlaff, as he was considered to be the grandfather of China Inland Mission. And I called you, I asked you if you've ever heard about him before. And then I began to just share the little bit that I knew about him. And what I knew about him is that he was buried not far from my house there in Hong Kong. He was basically ostracized and kicked out of the missionary community, which made me already like him.
The first red flag was, here's a guy that supposedly was the grandfather of probably the most well-known missions organization that impacted China. I mean, if people know a China missionary, they think Hudson Taylor, if they're going to know any.
Yep.
And so you have the grandfather of his missions organization, and you and I, who like to think we're fairly well-read on mission, particularly China mission, were not familiar. So I think immediately we had alarm bells.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I started to read about him, I thought, why have I never heard about this guy before? Because he was the first missionary to Thailand, the first missionary to Cambodia, the first missionary to Laos, the first missionary to Korea, first missionary to Japan. He was the first missionary to China from Germany. He was supported by the king of Germany. I mean, he had all these amazing kind of pioneer, trailblazing markers in his life, and yet I had never heard of him.
Well, and it would be like the most amazing kids story ever. Like, you'd think it'd be one of those well-known kids books, and it'd be like something that like teenagers would know. Because I mean, he was just kind of a push the boat out kind of guy that like broke. Well, I mean, that's what we came to learn, was the way that he worked, his methodology, and actually, in the end, a lot of that was why he was so impactful and successful. But on the same side, it's the reason that he was shunned from history.
Yeah, well, I mean, at the time, he believed that you could train up Chinese evangelists to reach the Chinese. All of the foreign missionaries at that time were completely against it, except for Robert Morrison. Robert Morrison kind of got it. He was a pioneer. That's why the two of them got together. That's why the two of them worked so well together. But everybody else hated Karl Gutzlaff. And one of the things that I began to think, because as I began to read more and more, one of the things I realized was this. At that time, in the early 1800s, most missionaries in China were only able to see a handful of converts. Like Robert Morrison.
If that.
Yeah. Robert Morrison was over 20 years and had less than a dozen people that came to Christ. And all of a sudden, Karl Gutzlaff comes in there, starts working with Chinese evangelists, and sees thousands of people come to Christ. So I began to wonder, like, was this a little bit of Christian envy? Like, were people that were the experts in China a little bit miffed that they were not seeing the same results, and so they wanted to poke holes in the progress that he was having? And so I began to read, and the more and more I read, the more I realized that maybe that was the case.
Well, and also it's interesting because the way they approached it wasn't, okay, he seems to be doing an amazing job. Let's go and see how he's doing it and encourage him and build up and learn from it and see if we can do it. They went with the intention of, let's see if the people he's saying are converts are real converts. Do they pass our test? Do they pass our checklist of what it means to be a true Christian? And do they meet the bar in order to be considered a true believer, which was actually kind of common back then. There's other books in the past, The Lame Shall Take the Prey with George Stott, and he was really big on like, you had to be in the church at least a year. You had to like know certain scripture off by heart.
It was like they didn't want people to become Christian.
Yeah.
Like you had to pass an exam.
Yeah, it was like going to Bible school.
They would like evaluate you like you're getting Christian credits.
And then if you like made a mistake, you were out. Yeah. You wouldn't be allowed back in the church for like a whole year until you'd fixed yourself.
And I remember when we were doing the George Stott book and the Griffith John book, we didn't really understand, like, where's that mentality?
It seemed really unreasonable, I think, to us.
But it started with Karl Gutzlaff. like a lot of those missionaries began to put and implement certain like barriers that you had to break through as a Chinese believer before you were accepted as a real believer. You had to go through these different levels of evaluation. You had to prove yourself. And these days, the time periods of proving, like you said, was like a year long, sometimes even longer.
Yeah.
And if you'd done one little thing, it would either go back to reset or you would be kicked out forever.
I think as well the problem with Karl Gutzlaff was a lot of his converts, if you want to call them that, the people that he'd led to Christ, had backgrounds of opium addiction, serious drug addiction.
Exactly.
And a lot of them, and we can talk about that maybe now because that's part of his controversy, a lot of them would kind of fall in and out of this drug. I mean, some of them were set free and never went back to it, never touched it. Some of them would be free from it for a while, and then they might fall back into it for a while, and then they would be free from it. And so there was this, I mean, now we might say realistic struggle that these guys had with their past life or with their vices or whatever you want to call it. But the missionaries that were investigating Karl Gutzlaff figured that if these guys went back to opium even one time, they were never truly saved.
Yeah, and I mean, how many churches or fellowships have you come across? I mean, I've encountered a few where when God delivers you and sets you free, you're free forever.
Yeah.
And that is one argument. I'm not taking a side on theology, whether that's true or not, but there were certain situations in China during that time where individuals were addicted to opium, and they were set free through the good news of Jesus Christ that Karl brought to them. And Karl, by the way, was a doctor. And so Karl actually developed the very first drug addiction strategy to help people break off that addiction. Yeah. And so at that time, I mean, this is hard for us to think about, but in the 1800s, addiction was not a disease. And in the 1800s, people thought either you want to stop or you don't want to stop. End of discussion.
Yeah.
There was no thought of being addicted, going through rehab,
Having
taking
biological
drugs,
responses.
having biological responses. Yeah. Karl Gutzlaff was the pioneer in breaking through the studies. He worked with so many drug addicts. And
well, and I think a lot of the people that were deciding that these Chinese believers were fake Christians or real Christians, it was all about the outward performance. It wasn't really about what was going on the inside of them or whether they were really fighting to try and live right after they've been radically changed and exposed to the gospel. It was, are you doing the right things? And if you weren't, it was all surface evaluation, because the reality is, could they really know who was saved and who wasn't? I mean, that's up for debate. Certainly not from just looking at a bunch of people and saying that Karl Gutzlaff was essentially a fraud.
Yep. And what I did is I was able to dig into certain archives around the world and find the minutes, the journals of people that were in this like almost like a miniature trial.
Yeah.
Where Karl Gutzlaff, in his absence, when he went to do fundraising one year in England, in his absence, the leaders of the mission community came together and started to bring these former addicts together. And then they began to ask them, when Karl gave you a Bible, what did you do? And they admitted in front of this panel, this committee, that yes, I told Karl that I went to the remote areas and I gave out Bibles. I gave him fake numbers of the people that I reached in the villages. And then I sold the Bible in the back door of the printer. And then Karl would come back through the front door of the printer and repurchase those Bibles. And the way the missionaries were able to trap Karl was they began to mark the Bibles. And then they would watch to see, do those marked Bibles come back through? And some of them did.
Some of them. It's important. Was it like 40% or something, if I remember right?
It was much lower than that. It was, it was not that many people, but it was enough to get, they didn't bring everybody to these hearings. So they did, out of 100, they didn't bring 100. Out of 100, maybe they brought 10. And 8 of them would say, yeah, you know, I did this. And then they would focus on the testimony of like 1 or 2. And then they wrote their whole entire mission board report from that testimony of 1 or 2. And here's the thing. They were able to send that report to Europe while Karl Gutzlaff was on tour raising funds. And so he found himself in the middle of a scandal. While he was in Europe raising money for Bibles in China, missionaries basically attacked him by sending this report to church leaders in Europe that confronted Karl, humiliated Karl, and when Karl went back to China, he ended up dying within a matter of months.
Basically alone.
Yeah.
No friends, no colleagues, no all the people that had kind of followed in his footsteps his whole life were gone.
Yep.
He was cast out and essentially forgotten from history.
Yep.
Except for people like Hudson Taylor.
Hudson Taylor comes in. He comes into this story right in the middle where things are starting to shift. So he applied to be with this Chinese Evangelistic Association, but while he was going through the process and after his acceptance, but before he shipped out, this whole controversy takes place. So by the time Hudson Taylor arrives in China, walking in the footsteps of Karl Gutzlaff, trained by the teachings of Karl Gutzlaff, he finds himself in China with no support because Karl Gutzlaff, the leader of the organization, dies. The funding for Karl Gutzlaff, which is supposed to support Hudson Taylor, is gone. So Hudson Taylor is now in China with no lunch money and nowhere to go. And that's what helps him start China Inland Mission.
And he gave so much credit to Karl Gutzlaff.
He did.
Calling him the grandfather of the China Inland Mission. I mean, in some ways, Hudson Taylor was risking the reputation of the China Inland Mission by saying that, because there would have been so many people that would have heard the association with Karl Gutzlaff, whether what they heard was true or not, because I can only imagine through the Chinese whispers what ended up being said about Karl Gutzlaff that probably went even further than what the missionaries even intended in the beginning. But these people that had this perception now of Karl Gutzlaff after he died, for Hudson Taylor to join himself so closely to Karl Gutzlaff was incredibly brave of him to do. And to be honest, I feel that God honored him for it, because it's the whole reason why we do what we do with Underground Publishing House. It's honoring the legacy of those that have dug the ground before you.
Yeah.
And I think he understood that.
One of the things that I really appreciate is exactly what you said about Hudson Taylor. And Hudson Taylor could have completely blamed everything on Karl Gutzlaff and said, you know what, I came here, I was tricked, and joined a big organization and followed in the footsteps of those that attacked Karl Gutzlaff. But he would not have seen the converts. There was something that was like renegade material of both Hudson Taylor and Karl Gutzlaff. When we see Karl Gutzlaff, one of the things that he did that highlighted the hypocrisy of the church at that time is that he traveled on the opium ships, which were the only boats that were able to go into China. And because he traveled with these opium boats, the missionary said, that is so wrong. Opium is bad for people. Christians should not be involved in it.
You shouldn't even be associated.
You should not even be associated. And yet, the hypocrisy, because there was no missionary alive in China that was able to survive without the drug trade, because they did all of their mail back and forth to Europe, to England. All of the posts went back and forth using the East India Company, which was a part of the drug trade. If you wanted to do any currency exchange, trade your gold for local currency, or your local currency for gold, or sterling for the Chinese money, you had to use the East India Trade Company. So everybody was using the East India Trade Company.
Half of them were sitting there doing nothing. Well, I don't want to say doing nothing, but they were sitting there waiting for the magical day for China to just open and welcome them in with open arms. And Karl Gutzlaff said, I'm not going to wait for that. There will be a door somehow, some way. And he picked the first one he saw and he ran through it and was criticized to the ends of the earth for it.
There was just no...
And yet he opened the door to all of the others that followed.
There was no place that was closed off. Everybody said, Korea, you can't go. He went. Japan, impossible. He went. They said, inland China, impossible. He went. He was the first person to dress like the Chinese, look like the Chinese. In fact, he spoke 20 languages so fluently that even though he was from Germany, The Dutch thought he was Dutch because his Dutch was so good. The Brits thought he was British. They wanted to make him an official, but then when they found out he wasn't actually
German.
British, then they couldn't. So he even changed his name from Karl Gutzlaff to Charles,
Yeah.
just so that it would be more Anglo.
Yeah.
And he spoke Chinese, several different dialects of Chinese with such fluency that the Chinese did not believe that he was a foreigner. They thought that his mother, at least, was Chinese because he spoke such pure forms of their language.
It's just interesting when you look at his life and the controversy, and I don't think either of us would argue that every decision he made was right, like all of us. Some of the decisions he made, maybe we wouldn't do, maybe we would, I don't know. But it's interesting to look at these people that kind of forge new roads that have never been forged. The knee-jerk reaction sometimes is to criticize or to question or to look for reasons to poke holes, rather than actually thinking maybe they're forging a road that people behind them for generations may end up following.
One of the things that I appreciate about him and really brought me in so closely with him is that no person is perfect. And so he represents a person that was full of flaws, no doubt about it, but also a person that God used.
Yeah.
And I see myself in that same place, that I am full of flaws, but I beg God, please make this broken vessel useful to you.
But he also, as well as that, had a relentless spirit. It was like any wall he came up against, he either bust through it or he found another way. Like he was constantly moving. That was one of the criticisms, is he starts something and he leaves it. He never finishes anything. He never sees it through to the end. But he was a pioneer in the truest sense. But actually, when we were working on it and we got to the end, I think it's actually kind of a moving story too. I mean, it's a real kind of, it will stoke a fire in you for sure, but the end of his life was pretty sad. And I think that in a lot of ways, his life gives us some real lessons on maybe how we should look at people that are pioneers or that might do things differently. Not that anyone's like immune to criticism, but maybe our intentions we should check every now and then.
Yeah. One of the reasons why I think that his story is probably one of the most important stories in the history of China is because in many ways he's the single most deciding factor for the China that we have today. In this way, Hong Kong was selected by him, at least in most part. Shanghai was one of the free ports that he had suggested when he became a spy for the British military.
Another point of controversy.
Yeah, another point of controversy because he was a spy as well as a magistrate that oversaw different areas on behalf of the British government during the Opium Wars between China and England. But I tell you that the devastation on China would have been so much greater had Karl Gutzlaff not held them back. The war between England and China was going to happen because in many ways China was like poking the bear. They literally kind of poked the world's strongest navy and military at that time. And Karl Gutzlaff warned them not to do that, but when they did it, it set the Brits off. The Brits went to war, and Karl became a spy and fed information to the Brits to get that war over faster. He was able to take them straight to the emperor's palace and help with the translation and the signing of the treaty.
Regardless, there would be some people that would say, even so, a Christian should not put himself in that position.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think there will be people where someone might read this book and say, he's my hero. Someone else might read this book and say, I would never have anything to do with this guy ever. And I think regardless, you actually, your eyes will be open to a whole new way of what mission can be.
And I think that the way the book is written as well is written in a way where you will see Karl Gutzlaff as a hero in one chapter and a demon in the next.
Well,
like the reason I say that is because we start off this book from the very beginning, the two most influential individuals in the history of China, in many ways, It's Hudson Taylor for the Christians with the underground house church that we're seeing right now, with the largest revivals in the world, really having their seeds
Yeah.
there. And then you also see the Communist Party of China getting its seed from Karl Marx. We start off, true story,
Spoiler.
yeah, with Karl Marx sitting in a sermon of Karl Gutzlaff, learning from Karl Gutzlaff, taking his
China.
notes. Yeah. And so some of the ideas of communism from Karl Marx came from Karl Gutzlaff's exposure in writings that were very prolific all throughout Europe at that time.
He was writing about like the insects that were in China and the
Yeah.
landscapes that were in China. I mean, because people had just never seen
Creation,
anything. Yeah.
everything, yeah.
So when you say that Karl Marx was learning, he wasn't learning how to become communist. It wasn't anything like that, but he was learning about the nation of China.
The nation of China, the empire, the emperor, as it relates to the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, how those two mix. He was able to use China, one of the most ancient civilizations, as his bedrock of showing how these two actually operate in every single civilization. He did that because of Karl Gutzlaff. But the thing is that you learn in that book that he was an influence on Karl Marx and an influence on Hudson Taylor. Both of those transforming China forever.
And most people have never heard his name.
Yeah. That's why we call this book Karl Gutzlaff, God's Renegade, because he really was a renegade.
Yeah.
You can get that now. You can go to backtojerusalem.com or amazon.com, wherever you buy your books, and find God's Renegade, the true story of Karl Gutzlaff. It's going to be unlike anything you've ever read before.